Christmas Day we all played football in the mud of no man's land. Tommy brought some Christmas pudding, Fritz brought out a German band. When they beat us at the football, we shared out all the grub and drink. And Fritz showed me a faded photo of a brown-haired girl back in Berlin.
Welcome to our latest lunchtime lecture at the Record Cafe. For those, I noticed we've got a Brecon City fan in today. This must be a first. It's not really, it's Mick, isn't it? But, welcome. It's great to have such a good turnout this morning for Alex. I've been trying to get Alex across for a while from the National Football Museum in Manchester. And to speak about his book, Football's Great War. Now, the TNA yesterday went a bit heavy on the Bradford City players. We know their story, essentially, don't we? The Jimmy Spears, Robert Torres, etc. But Alex is going to give us an insight into football during the war and how it went on. So please, a warm welcome to Alex.
Thanks very much. I'm not too used to speaking with a microphone. Is that all right? Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, like that. Is that better? Is that better now? Can you hear me? No. Oh.
Technical adjustments.
Is that better now? Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for all coming out today. It's a real pleasure seeing you all here today. Are we all Bradford City fans? Do we have any fans of any other clubs at all? Oh, this is a very partisan audience, so I have to be very careful what I say about Bradford City today. But I may be talking slightly ill of Leeds City, so I'm sure that will go down fine in a little bit. So yeah, I've been a curator at the National Football Museum for soberingly now 13 odd years or so, and this book came out of an exhibition we did really. Back in 2014, we did an exhibition called I'm trying to remember that. The Greater Game, that was it, based on a recruiting poster. And that was about football, both at the front lines, on the home front. But then out of that, I realised there was a gap very much on the home front side. Because when we imagine what people know mostly about the first football in the First World War is often connected to the front lines. It might be stories, for example, of you might be able to just briefly see the football up there. That's one of the most amazing objects I've had the privilege to work with. Because that is, excuse me, that is one of the only remaining football that was kicked ahead of the East Surrey Regiment during the first day of the Somme. Their officer gave them a football, basically something to sort of distract the men from that fear of going over the front, and said, you can kick this football ahead as you attack the enemy lines. So 2 of these footballs were bought. Both survived the war, but sadly one was burnt in a fire that affected the Regimental Museum a few years ago. So the one that you see there is the only remaining one left. And then in the centre is the Victoria Cross of Donald Simpson Bell of Bradford Park Avenue, who was the only English professional footballer to be awarded the Victoria Cross. And so these are obviously these very powerful stories of football at the front lines, of soldiers joining up. And you've probably also, I think you've had some talks here in the past about the role of women's football during the First World War, which is really important. It's a really key moment when women's football becomes popularised, it rises, and then sadly is crushed, although not extinguished, after the First World War. So these are the kind of stories that we're often sort of, I think, more familiar with. But what I was particularly taken when I started the research for the book was this cartoon from the Sheffield Telegraph and Star sports special, or the old Green 'Un, as it used to be. I'm sure you're familiar with those old sports specials. So this was produced in 1919, just after the war had come back, and it's inspired by a famous World War I recruiting poster which shows a man sat after the war, he's in his chair, his small children are playing around with him, and one of them asks, "Daddy, what did you do during the Great War?" And he looks quite pained, indicating that he might have not volunteered, he didn't serve. And so it's trying to basically guilt you into joining up. And so what's quite different with this one is we have Tommy D. Malt, who's come back from the Western Front, and he's asking Mr. Football, who sat in his nice comfy chair, what did you do during the war? But Mr. Football is very happy to talk about it. He's got the Sheffield Telegraph Football Guide, which will give you all the stats, the details. And so I found this quite interesting because the Sheffield Greenham was printed throughout the war. It covers all of the football that took place, but it's a story that's never sort of up until recently been explored and looked at. And so that's what I'm going to try and do a little bit today, is sort of focus on that. What would the kind of football be that if you as fans were turning up here on a Saturday to go and see Bradford City or Park Avenue, what might you see during those wartime seasons, especially between 1915 and 1918, which is a period of football that's often forgotten about? To just do a little bit of scene setting, when the First World War starts, football has gone through this really huge change. In about 50 years or so, it's gone from being a game that's been started off by ex-public school boys forming organised football. And from that amateur game, it's then morphed into this huge, amazing, big spectator sport. So on this side, the cartoon is from about 1913, when the FA celebrated its 50th anniversary, and it had a big do. I hear some of you were at a bit of a social event last night. So it may interest you to know that sort of when the FA celebrated their do, they invited all of the representatives of FIFA, all the county FAs. They had about 400 people at Holborn Restaurant down in London. And I think it had about 7 to 9 courses, each accompanied by a different alcoholic drink. Everything from hock, sherry, champagne, you name it, the booze flowed for this evening. And so what's really lovely about this, it's this kind of moment where they're reflecting on how the game has developed. It's become hugely popular as a spectator sport, attracting tens of thousands, millions of spectators a season. Excuse me. Sorry. And it's moved from being small amateur clubs to the big professional clubs that we know today. You've got by the start of the First World War, well-established clubs that historically go back to the 1860s, and some nouveau riche sides such as Bradford City, obviously only just formed in about the decade or so before the First World War, and Chelsea are another example of that. And they're clubs that are formed essentially by men who are wanting to capitalise on this interest in sports. What you also get with that is concerns around football. And some of that obviously, as you can imagine, is around the money side of it. Some people are uncomfortable with this game that is now a spectator sport, that the working classes turn up to watch, not play. And you can see some of that reflected in sort of that idea of this being this mass entertainment with the huge crowds of people gathered around this hierarchy of king football sat on this throne of money and leagues. So this means that when the war does come along, it's a very sort of tense, it sort of comes along where there are these existing fault lines that are then exacerbated by the war. So one of the things I think sometimes people think about the First World War is this image of everyone rushing to join up right at the beginning. There's this big overwhelming popular enthusiasm. And the reality is it's quite different, is that when the war does come along, it's met, as you might imagine, with actually a lot more uncertainty. So in this cartoon you see representatives of the northeastern clubs, and they're worried by the menacing cloud of war that's there in the background. And the cartoon says, is this going to swallow up everything? Because there's huge uncertainty should the football season go ahead. The cricket season's already going ahead and sort of comes to a sort of a temporary halt. But all the other major sort of autumnal winter sports have this big decision. Do we continue or don't we? And so initially, football, some within football say we should perhaps shut down, but overall there's this feeling that we should go ahead. The Prime Minister, Asquith at the time, calls for business as normal. And so football clubs see like, well actually if we continue playing, we're not going to disrupt society, we can provide, and these are the arguments that are given for continuing football throughout the war, we provide relief for civilians who can't go to the front, munition workers, we provide them with entertainment. We're also an industry, we've got to keep giving jobs to people and employment to people who work at clubs, whether they be players, staff, managers, and so there's more to be gained by continuing than there is to be stopped, or at least that's one way of looking at it. However, that obviously doesn't go down too well with some people and it's quite important, there are some people who are opposed to football because of their pre-war concerns around money, and a lot of that comes from certain elements of the right-wing press, essentially arch-conservatives, also teetotalers, so obviously that's an interesting one in this particular setting, There's a gentleman called Charrington who actually grew up as the son of a big beer production company, and he essentially rejected his family inheritance to wage essentially pre-First World War a campaign against the music halls, which are often in some areas a cover for prostitution. But then also when it came to the First World War, he decided that he really didn't like football, and so he spent a lot of time campaigning very publicly about it. Even went to Fulham, was invited to give a recruiting speech, and decided at the last minute he was going to basically harangue everyone and say. At which point the Fulham stewards removed him, and he then sued Fulham for assault. But however, that was thrown out after it was revealed that his silk hat did not leave his head, and his feet were gently moved off the stadium, which gives you some idea of sort of like the passions being aroused by this. But also, to be fair as well, obviously, if you have sons, you have nephews joining up, and you've seen them being killed in the first months of the war at the front, the sights of tens of thousands of people going to a football match can be provocative. They can make you think about, where does the country have its priorities? Does it have those right? So this poster on this side gives you a little bit of a feel for how, again, sort of football is being picked out in this. What's quite revealing about it is the picture shows a football crowd in the background, whilst there's men fighting at the front. However, the photograph of the crowd is a peacetime photograph. It's not an actually wartime one, and there was a lot of discussion at the time about how accurate some of the debates were being made about whether football crowds were large or were they decreasing. And in fact, they actually decreased a lot because men were joining up. Sorry?
The shed at Chelsea.
I think that is...
That's never very peaceful, that's the thing.
Yeah, I think in that background of that one, I think it's an England versus Scotland pre-war international game, which means it's a little bit tricky to see where it could be, because England didn't have Wembley at that time, so they moved around quite a number of different stadia around the country. It's because it's got the running track. It could be Chelsea, or it could be one or two other ones. I'll have to look into that one. Yeah, that's a good. And so on the flip side, you have essentially what is a big public debate, propaganda battle between anti-football on one side and pro-football, obviously led by the clubs, football organisations, and also supportive newspapers, especially press ones. And so again, this comes from the Sheffield Greenan. And so what you're seeing there is the gentleman there is dressed as a professional mourner, and this kind of figure was used to depict cranks, faddists, and people who also held sorts of strange and strong opinions about various different things at the time. And so he's beating this drum that says, stop the game, protest, cant, letters to the press, make all footballers enlist, because there was this feeling that footballers should all enlist straight away, and if they weren't, they were cowards. Ignoring the fact that many footballers were married, and at that time they encouraged single men to volunteer first, not married men. As you can imagine with these things, you get these big public debates where nuance comes very low, second, third or fourth, fifth to strength of opinion, and getting strong sort of arguments out there. And in the background, there's a footballer doing his bit for the war effort, because clubs were starting to donate money to the war effort, to relief funds. Players took a pay cut. It's very interesting because players took a pay cut, or rather were forced to take a pay cut, because the football clubs opted against pooling their money and making donations as well, or sharing it out to help the poorer teams be able to play their pairs, which is a reoccurring theme which we might come back to later. So what happens is at the end of the 1914-15 season, this is the point where in a lot of narratives they say football shuts down, there's no more football, football goes to the front, and women's football kind of fills the void, more or less. And so actually that's very inaccurate. But what happens is it arises because in the summer of 1915, the FA decides to ban the payment of players, so not professionalism, the payment of players quite specifically. And this is very interesting because essentially for the next 3 or 4 years, the FA essentially embarks on an experiment of returning football to its pre-war, pre-professionalism roots. And so this comes out essentially sort of out of like middle class concern about the anti-war arguments that come before, the criticism. But it's not the only route they could have taken. in Scotland and Ireland, players had much more, managed professionalism, where payments were reduced to a maximum of £1 a week. So basically you could earn a living from football, but you weren't going to learn all of your living from football in Scotland and Ireland. So you went and got a job in a factory, you worked for the war effort. But in England, they go through this very sort of hardline approach where only players, and I keep saying players because if you were a coach, a trainer, a ground staff member, if you worked on the letting people into the ground, you still earned a living. You could still get money from being involved in football. It's the poor old players who basically have to pay the way for everyone else and make the savings that allow clubs to run. Because obviously you're operating on reduced crowds, but you're still getting money through the gate. But for some people, for some writers, they welcomed it. So you can see Mr. Football, and there's a little pump called New Amateur Conditions. And so he's been washed clean of the sins of professionalism. The mud has been swept away. And so it's always very interesting when obviously even still today, when we talk about too much money in the game, there's this idea of returning to some kind of sort of better past, whether it be 10, 20, 30, 40 years away. But what's quite interesting is some of the people who opposed this at the time saying, well, we can say we're not going to pay the players, but we know what's probably going to happen. We're going to have the same kind of shamatrism, which is a term that was sort of originated in about the 1870s, to describe essentially under-the-counter payments when you say you can't pay players. But if you look very carefully in your boots at the end of a game, you might find there's a few bob there. Or you might have a game, famously, this even continued after professionalism brought back. In Sunderland in the 50s, the club chairman used to play a game of snooker against the players after a game. £2 bet. Chairman never won. So this is the sort of, if there's one thing to take away from today, this is this really fascinating period where this then shapes the rest of what comes afterwards, because it moves it from being openly professional to, as we'll see, something slightly more murky. Now, apologies, this is a bit of a slide from an academic presentation, but what you can't see particularly well there, but that is a very large crowd for Everton versus Stoke in 1916. And so just to give you some idea of how popular football still was, relatively speaking, total crowd attendances in sort of the top flights were about 15 million in 1913-14 season. Then that drops to about just under 9.5 for the first wartime season. Drops then to sort of a steady sort of between about 3.6 million to 3.3 and 3.4 during the rest of the wartime seasons, and then rises dramatically back up to 6.4 in the 1918-19 season, which is both wartime and peacetime. And so that goes to show that while football does decrease in numbers, it's still a major it's a major spectator sport that attracts lots of people on a regular basis. And I think also to put this into wider context, county cricket stops during the war. Racehorsing is largely curtailed as well. And rugby league continues, again with reduced numbers. So football remains the sort of the largest outdoor spectator sport, and it keeps place throughout the war. So one of the interesting things that does come out of the war, in terms of long-term change, is that for the first time, we have clubs starting to pool their gates to share out some of the proceeds. So prior to the war, you just kept your home gate. That's how you got your money, either that or you sold players. What you have, obviously, in this challenge is that some clubs are able to do quite well by crowds and some struggle quite badly. So, for example, Grimsby, a lot of their guys join up in the army, even more in the navy. And so they have very tiny crowds compared to, say, somewhere like Manchester, big munitions factories, big crowds to draw upon. So the idea of the Football League, this idea of the strong supporting the weak, really begins to develop. And so they actually start sharing gates a little bit. We also see it down in the south in some of the smaller leagues. And what I should also add is that during the war, they continue with regional leagues to cut down the travel. So basically, there's a Midland League, a Lancashire League, and a London League. And then there are some very smaller ones down south. So that's where you see, with the football, this one is a reference to one of the smaller southern groups where Swindon are taking part. Which I believe you're playing Swindon today, is it? Yeah. And so the Swindon representative there is advocating this idea of sharing money around. And at the bottom, there's some people, there's a couple of fans, and one says, "Hey Bill, this socialist idea is all right, isn't it?" And the other guy says, "No, it's all right if you've not got no brass," which indicates some of the challenges around this idea of being open to the sharing of money. Because obviously some people go like, "Well, it's just, if you haven't got any money, trying to get some money off me." But what's quite interesting is this gate sharing in the first season takes place, is relatively successful, but the big clubs are the ones that are stumping up the money. So at the annual meeting of the Football League in 1916, the Everton representative gets up, and there's a wonderful description of how, in the words of the Sheffield Telegraph correspondent, the Everton representative got up and said he did not wish to issue a threat, and then issued the most effective threat I've heard for many years, in which he said that whilst they didn't want to sort of browbeat people into it, he and his fellow representatives of other larger clubs had been getting together and having a little think. And basically, if they didn't take away gate sharing, they'd leave the league and go and form their own little mini league together with them and some of the Manchester clubs, Blackburn. Trying to think, there was the Blackburn clubs, the Liverpool clubs, and some of the one or two of the larger ones. At which point, all the little clubs went, "We can't really afford to lose the big ones, so we better give in and give them what they want." Unfortunately, that meant that those smaller clubs were really struggling, and so they had to bring back in gate sharing. And so this cartoon shows the rich club holding out his hand to try and help the little club step over the muddy waters of wartime football. And this is not ironically, this is interesting because this is from a Liverpool newspaper, trying to basically shame the clubs into doing the right thing, because they're kind of saying actually guys, you're being selfish, it's been not in the spirit of wartime football. But not all clubs continue and organise football at all. And so there's a small group of clubs who stand out completely. Basically in the Midlands clubs of Aston Villa, Wolverhampton Wanderers, Birmingham City for a season, West Bromwich Albion, the three northeastern clubs of Newcastle, Sunderland and Middlesbrough, and Blackburn Rovers for a season or so as well. And they essentially say, we're not going to take part in any organised football at all, because that's going to distract people from going to the factories. That's not the important thing going on here. But what's quite interesting is within the football community, there's a lot of hostility to this. And so this cartoon was printed in the Manchester press, and it shows the clubs, the representative of the clubs kind of looking at, this is a sort of a version of a recruiting poster, basically saying, have you stimulated recruiting, entertained wounded soldiers, soldiers on leave, and have you helped raise money for charity, which are all the arguments for continuing. And you won't be able to see, but the Aston Villa figure in the middle, who were, with Villa being recognised, sort of seen as the leaders of this sort of anti-football movement within football, he has a little moustache, which, funnily enough, looks very much like the Kaiser's moustache. And it was a reoccurring theme across a number of newspapers. And so Aston Villa, it's also quite interesting because the Birmingham sports press is very hostile to the Birmingham clubs and essentially spends 1915-16 waging a campaign of trying to humiliate and mock them into action, unsuccessfully, more or less. But it gets to the point where the relationships are broken down so much that when the Birmingham sports papers send their staff member out to do the annual collection for their Christmas fund, they're told, basically, no, we're not giving you anything. You need to remember that you need Aston Villa, but Aston Villa doesn't need you. Which gives a little bit of indication of sort of how sort of heated these arguments could get. So this is one of my favourite cartoons because obviously now I'm going to sort of talk a bit more about those seasons between 15 and 18. And so one of the big challenges, if you as a fan, one of the things you get to see is a lot more players, potentially a lot of players you didn't recognise that have been recruited from all sorts of different sources. Although I hear you've had a bit of an injury crisis this season, so you probably got used to seeing a few different players appear on the team sheet. And so this illustrates the trials and troubles of a team manager who has to get up very early in the morning, about 8 o'clock. His first news while having breakfast is news from all these players saying and if anyone who's played in an amateur team will probably kind of imagine these kind of scenarios. where it's like getting the message to say like, I can't get off work, I can't turn up. He's then going around the houses, knocking on people's doors to see if he can get them out, see who's available. Unfortunately, I think it's on this one it says, he's asking someone's wife and they're saying, no, we can't come out. He's then got to dash off to the train station, and this is also during the war. If you think train travel in modern Britain is bad, First World War genuinely was much more harder, because priority had to be given to military traffic. So you had train journeys that might in peacetime take about an hour and a half, might take 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. So he's dashing off to the train station. I do believe one time the Bradford Park Avenue manager left Bradford with 1 player and 3 sports reporters, and then picked up the rest of his team slowly as he got along the way to the match. It shows him having arrived at the game and being a man short, donning a jersey, and this is not an actual joke. I'm trying to remember, I think it was the Brentford team actually had to play their manager, who was a mere 38 years old and only recently retired. But more than 1 or 2 other occasions, 1 or 2 managers had to get ready at the last minute. And often teams would turn up and would start with 10 men, might have players join them partway through the game. Sheffield United famously borrowed a 16-year-old to come to watch them play away at Leeds City. And because they hadn't had enough players, they sort of started looking around on the train station. One youth basically chanced his arm and said I'll give it a go. And in Grimsby, I don't remember, I think it was the Grimsby chairman's son played on at least 2 to 3 occasions for opposition teams who turned up with about 9 or 10 players and were therefore short. And there's often 1 or 2 stories of players who have basically been loaned out for the day scoring the winning goal against their own team, which is always a good fun. There we see the poor manager who just got back home, exhausted by all of these shenanigans. The worst one again was trying to get to away games at Grimsby, and so the Nottingham papers have got some great descriptions of the Leicester players, sometimes getting back as late as missing the last train and then not getting back until the following, I think about 10 o'clock on a Sunday, something like that in the morning. So I could go on for ages with fun stories of players and all their trails and travels. But one of the things you also got to see was youngsters being given a bit more of a chance, and also sometimes players being brought out of retirement. So does anyone remember the Golden Gordon from the Monty Pythons when they did the Ripping Yarn series? So in that one, the superfan brings the team of retired heroes from about 10, 15 years ago out of retirement. And actually what you do see in some games is 1 or 2 players in their 40s who've been retired for a good 6 or 7 years being brought out. So this cartoon sort of imagines this future where basically there's like granddad playing with grandson. So you didn't have anything quite like that, but one Chesterfield game did involve a father and son playing alongside each other with about a 20-odd year age difference between the pair of them. But then also there's a kind of a sadder side to this sort of rush for players from any kind of source. Bob Benson was a very talented player for Sheffield United, previously played at Newcastle, and he was playing at Arsenal before the war started. He then spent, after the war, he got a job in the munitions factory, spent about 12 months or so not playing, turned up to watch one day, come along with his father-in-law, come along with his wife, and then they spotted him before kick-off. They're a bit short and said oh Bob, will you do us a massive favour? So Bob goes and plays, but then sadly suffers a brain hemorrhage, which may or may not be brought on from the stress of overplaying. He'd worked like a sort of 12, 14-hour day in the munitions factory beforehand. So you had this column by Andrew Wilson, who's a Sheffield Wednesday player, saying players need to really consider how much you want to put yourself through if you're going to help out your teammates. So what you also see during wartime is actually the success of some of the smaller clubs, because not everyone can compete. It's not a sort of a traditional monopoly of the big clubs. You actually have some smaller teams coming through who in wartime conditions can attract some of the different better players and do well. And so one of them is Stoke. And so this cartoon, which I love, it's one of my favourites because you're not usually expecting to see Alice in Wonderland references. But it shows the scene where Alice is eating the cakes and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's reflecting, she's eating the little cakes from the plates of Manchester, Bolton and Everton. And so Stoke did very well. They started competing. Quite a few of their players were on working in the coal industry, so they weren't called up. So there was a little bit of hostility towards them, especially after they beat Blackburn Rovers in what is the record score during wartime football of. Would anyone like to have a guess? What do you think is a big score? What would you think of as a score? Any numbers out there?
13-0.
13. I've got a 13. Any advance or lower?
18.
18. Oh, it's interesting. 18. Any others? So, it's brilliant, 16. Exactly. So Stoke beat Blackburn Rovers 16-0. So pre-war, Blackburn had won several league titles, the FA Cups. Stoke had been bankrupted and had to actually drop out the Football League completely. Had to earn their way back up. So Blackburn get absolutely thrashed, which, interestingly enough, is then leads to accusations of Stoke were unsporting, they shouldn't have scored so many. It's a travesty of football. Is it even a proper result? Is it a record? You have newspapers arguing about it. And so this cartoon on the left is from the Liverpool press, where they're kind of mocking this, saying like, oh, it's ridiculous, you know. They've got basically in one corner, they've got a man doing a highway robbery going like, give us some more, you know. But then on the right-hand side, that same Liverpool newspaper is celebrating Liverpool scoring over 100 goals just a few months later. And that's because Liverpool were in a contest with Stoke for the title of the Lancashire section. So it's very interesting how sort of like one 16-0 win is terrible and the worst thing to happen to football, and Liverpool beating someone else like 10-0 or 9-1 is like, oh no, it's fine, it's all right. So you also if you got to see a lot more goals, you also, and not to encourage this, you also got to see a lot more violence on the pitch as well. So this cartoon is from 1915 at the start, and so one of the ideas was that, if we're not paying players, it's going to be like pure amateurism. You know, there'll be better values, there's less to play for, there's no incentive to kick someone, punch them, etc. And so this one's really lovely because it has all sorts of things indicating a very middle-class approach to football. The referees offering some malted milk to a player who's been knocked out, and the player who's knocked out a player is saying, so sorry, old man, if I lost my temper there. In response, the player says, you'll hear from my people, i.e. my solicitors, about this. And so at the beginning, there is this initial sort of football is sort of like slightly more genteel and softer. However, it then starts to go downhill. And so just on the stats wise, how many sending offs do you think there were in the first division in peacetime?
Yes. 4.
Do I have any shouts out there?
20.
20. Any advances below or above? Did I hear 10 across 10? So the answer to that, there was one sending off in the entire season of 1913-14. Manchester United player, just for the record. Which I think says something about like, either there were players who were being like quite decent. There was probably, what you had there though was if you got sent off, you lost your wages. So that's a big thing. So if you lose 2 weeks' wages, even if you're getting quite a lot of money, that's a good incentive not to react if someone punches you, knocks you over, trips you, whatever. Once that's removed, wartime football becomes like working class, amateur grassroots football, where there's a lot more retaliation, responses to refs. So the numbers start rising. We go from one pre-First World War to sending offs that range between about the 20s and the 30s. And they're not just little sort of, what's going to get into? So this is, they're not little simple affairs of like people getting pushed off for shoving. Quite a lot of these took place in Yorkshire as well. So you'll see the foul tactics, and that's the Yorkshire League wallowing it. And obviously, shame for us all to have to hear this. And so these kind of events often involve retaliation. So when someone goes past a winger, gets knocked over, the winger is now much more likely to get up, turn around, and kick him or punch him. And when I say punch, quite a number of these ones are proper stand-up fights. One Tottenham player, I'm trying to remember now which way around it is. I think one Tottenham player knocks out another player, And so that player who's knocked out has to spend 10 minutes recovering on the touchline. But the epitome of some of this bad behaviour, again I'm ashamed to say, takes place in Sheffield, where there is a derby between Sheffield United and Sheffield Wednesday. And Sheffield United have a captain called George Utley, who won the cup with Barnsley in 1912, and then moved to Sheffield United. And so he came from a very robust Barnsley side, who were known as Battling Barnsley. And so at one point during the game, they're 1-0 up. Sheffield Wednesday player goes past him, gets tripped, at which point one of the Wednesday players shouts out, "That's Barnsley football for you." A little bit later, one of the Wednesday players gets their own back on George Utley, who's basically knocked out, which then leads to a fight between two of the players from either side. And so imagine a little bit like the Liverpool Keegan-Bremner fight. They're going at each other hammer and tongs, they're separated, sent off, they get to the touchline, and then they resume. And then they're separated, and then they look like they want to have like round 3, but they're eventually sort of forced out that way. So that's where some of these like newspaper headlines start trying to pull out a little bit. And has this wonderful one where Sheffield United captain put to sleep, and at the bottom it says, "Why should I be blamed?" Which, to be fair, he didn't trip one person, he didn't get involved in any of the fighting. But what I like about this one is that it says, "A calmer day expected against Bradford," which might have been true that season, but the following season, you ended up with one of the major wartime riots at a football game after Bradford City went to play Sheffield Wednesday. So what happened was the Bradford City centre half was being quite robust on a very icy pitch. And so this got wound up the Sheffield Wednesday fans. So when the Bradford City centre half is sent off, there's a sort of a bit of a dispute going on, there's a bit of a refusal to move, at which point, I think as the newspapers put it, 3 sailors who got fed up of waiting for the Germans to come out to fight them in the North Sea decided to take matters into their own hands. And they lead an invasion of several thousand people intent on taking a memento of the Bradford City centre half. So basically they go and have a pitch invasion, chase the Bradford City players down. Quite pleased to say that basically there's no undue harm done because the Sheffield Wednesday goalkeeper mans the tunnel at Hillsborough and basically fights them off and knocks a few of them down, of the over-enthusiastic fans down, and then basically the rest retreat from that. But then that leads to, obviously you can imagine a very big warning from the FA about the behaviour of fans at games. And also a reminder that servicemen are permitted to come to games, but they shouldn't really sort of be engaging in martial activities. So I'm just going to perhaps skip through the last 2 ones, I'm nearly there. What you also get is a rise in some of the more unsavoury aspects of football, which is match fixing and bribery. And so one of the most famous ones is the Good Friday match fixing, which involves Liverpool and Manchester United players. Basically, Manchester United are in a relegation battle, and Liverpool and Manchester United players fix a 2-0 win with the assistance of another player from Chester. This cartoon is referring to the fact that the fix was pretty obvious, but it took some time to investigate it. And so this is waiting for the report to come out. But essentially, a number of those players were banned for life, which was then reduced at the end of the war in kind of celebration of the war being over. Apart from one player, Enoch West, who challenged the FA and took them to court. And he maintained that he never took part in the fix, but he lost out both financially, and he remained banned up until he died in about the 1940s or 50s. I have to double check the dates on that one. But one of the Manchester United players who wasn't involved in that fix was a player called Anderson. And now you might be wondering why there is a strange picture of a sort of like leprechaun-esque figure. And see, what you have here is there's an Irish figure writing in Anderson's fairy tales, a new edition, which is a reference obviously to Hans Christian Andersen. Now Andersen, in about 1916, decided to go off to Ireland, funny enough around the time that conscription was introduced in mainland Britain, but was not introduced into Ireland. So apparently he needed to move there for his health, according to a note from his doctor. And there he played for Belfast United. And then at the same time, a number of letters came back to some of the British newspaper sports reporters, basically saying, I'm an English player, I've gone off to Ireland and I'm getting money. Screw you guys. And so it may not necessarily been Anderson, but there were one or two other players out there. And so this became a bit of a controversy at the time. Anderson actually then came back and started playing for Manchester United again, but then was found guilty of attempting to arrange fixes as the middleman between a secretive bunch of gamblers. So Anderson was actually sent to prison for attempting to defraud bookmakers because the players he approached didn't take the bets. They went to their own directors and set up a sting for him. So it's very much sort of Peaky Blinders-esque behaviour and shenanigans going on here. And so I'm just going to wrap it up. That's it. So I thought I had a slightly different cartoon, but this is the final one just to finish it up. So that's just to give you a little bit of an idea of like some of the interesting aspects of wartime football. In terms of obviously the wider significance and meaning of it, I've concentrated on the home front, but this cartoon shows a gentleman at home reading his newspaper, whilst the shades of a Tommy on active service says, "After you, old sport," And so this was done to encourage readers to send their newspapers to the front lines, because whilst you have this home front and the front lines, they're both connected. You have players going backwards and forwards, but also fans in the trenches. And so sports papers were really important to men at the front because provide this connection to home, to their civilian identities. And so you have some really touching letters throughout the war of men getting back in touch to say how are like United, Rovers, etc. going on. And I think some of the most interesting and fun bits that I enjoyed reading in those letters is men who are sort of like up late at night doing your nighttime sentry duty at the front lines. You might have a couple of guys stood next to each other, and obviously you've got hours to kill, so what do you chat about? Chat about football. And so you get these letters where it's basically, "Dear editor, can you help me settle my argument with Joe? Joe insists that Swindon played Fleming in the semi-final of the FA Cup in 1910, and I'm telling him he's dead wrong. Can you please settle for this argument for us?" And so there are these wonderful little moving insights into what at the end of the day might be seen as very unimportant, mundane things like 11 men playing another 11 men on a Saturday that actually have this really big significance in men's lives at the Western Front. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alex. It's a shame we didn't mention Leeds City being thrown out of the league, but anyway, there we go.
Oh yes,
For Max switching.
It was the oldest presentation.
Alex is back with us in February because we've no talks in January because of Sky Television and the police moving fixtures about. It was all midday because on them. So Alex is back with Pete Watson, the referees at Gringo, about South America, British referees in South America in the 1950s, I believe. So
yeah.
That'd be fantastic. Beware, of course, every time Pete Watson comes, the last 2 times he's been here, the match has been called off. So watch out. Andy, you've got to say. Andy wanted to say a couple of words. Andy Tynes here. He's not going to talk about a trip. Oh, by the way, City have drawn Blackpool or Aston Villa under 23s away in the Tom Noddy Cup. So big missing. Andy, go on, Andy.
Yeah, more than all. 13 years ago, this good gentleman to my left, Mr. Pendleton, arranged a trip to the battlefields of France and Belgium. And I think there were 30 of us on it.
Yeah,
And we visited each and every one of there were 10 Bradford City footballers who paid the ultimate sacrifice and died in the First World War. And lots of other things as well. We've tried to go at least once a year since. We had to miss out on COVID, but we've made up for it since. We will be having a trip this June as well. And this is just an invitation. If anybody wants to join us, you are more than welcome. We have a tremendous trip. It does involve some of this amber nectar of a Belgian variety, which is not to be missed. The best place to look for it is a Facebook site called Bus to Bradford. We'll explain the relevance of that for you shortly. There's some nodding heads, I suspect some of you have seen it already. So please have a look. We'll be going the last couple of days in June, the first couple of days in July. It is a trip not to be missed, I promise you. Thank you very much.
Well, the very sociable trips, shall we say that? A bit like last night, but with the wrong wheels. Anyway, thanks very much once again to Alex for coming across from Sheffield, rather.
Fires were burning bright. The order came, prepare offensive. Over the top, you're going tonight. And men stood waiting in the trenches, looked out across our football park, and all along the western front, the Christmas guns began to bark. Men stood waiting in the trenches, looked out across our football park, and all along the western front, the Christmas guns began to bark.